All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our January 2018 Hangout. My name is Jim Pingle, and this month we'll be talking about user management and privileges on pfSense 2.4. First up, we'll talk about project news. We'll go over, why you'd want to use multiple users. We'll talk about how the pfSense privilege system works, how to work with those privileges, and some caveats and gotchas and things to look out for. We'll go over group management, how the add privileges screen works, talk about user management, and we'll do a little bit of a demo of how different users work with different privileges. Then we'll talk about SSH access and authentication, a little bit about the sudo package, uh, show you a little bit about how SSH access works in practice. And then we'll talk about some security best practices for remote GUI access, SSH access, best practices in general, and just a little bit about external authentication servers, but not too much because we're going to talk about Radius and LDAP next month. Okay, for project news this month, our 2.4.3 release will be coming up soon. It'll have fixes for Meltdown Inspector. We're going to have fixes for them because when they come in through FreeBSD, but because pfSense usually runs in an appliance role, those vulnerabilities aren't terribly relevant to us because the firewall's not hosting virtual machines that would be running untrusted code, and it's not running, your firewall itself is not running arbitrary untrusted code in the way that, like, a user workstation would be. So it's not a huge concern as long as you don't have untrusted users with shell access that can run binaries, because mostly you're worried about accessing something accessing memory it shouldn't. And in an appliance role like that, where it's fairly isolated, it's not that giant of a concern. But we'll have fixes for that and some other bug fixes and some features we've snuck into 2.4.3 that we've merged in from PRs and whatnot. If you've been watching our blog, you'll know we've got a QNAP we're partnering up with to send to put pfSense out there as a paid virtualized guest on their NAS products in the near future. So that's coming up pretty soon. We're adding support for pfSense to the Espresso Bin ARM boards. It's another ARM board. It's AH64 Armada 3270 processor, or 3720 rather. It's got 3 gigabit ports. It's got a WAN port and then 2 LAN ports and a switch setup. So they're pretty neat little boards. They're fairly inexpensive, and I think we're going to start offering those directly. If we don't offer them directly, we think we're going to have like a paid image for that. But we got some news coming up about that shortly. Our 2018 training calendar is up. We've got just at netgate.com/training. So if you're looking for training or anything like that, just click that link and head on over there and sign up. We also, just a little bit of a translation update, we've got 349 registered translators and 16 languages that are 100% complete. And there's several more that are included in pfSense that are over that 75% barrier. So we're adding stuff all the time there. Okay, so on to our topic this month. Why would you want to utilize multiple users? Well, we've got security reasons, obviously, that are the number one thing. It keeps the number of people with the root or admin password low. You could even disable the admin account. You can't delete it, but you can disable it, or keep it with a secure randomized password that nobody knows, but maybe a centralized password manager type thing. It's easier to lock out somebody if they leave or they only need temporary access if they've got an account of their own instead of a role-based account. User access can be limited to specific pages they need to see, so you don't have to give everybody full access to the entire GUI. And you can also stop certain users from making configuration changes. Like you could let somebody see the firewall rules but not actually change them. Another reason is accountability. The configuration history will show users who made changes, and the firewall and NAT rules are tagged with the creator and last person to change. And let me show you how that works here. So if you go into diagnostics, backup, and restore here in the config history, you'll see every change that was made by a user is tagged with the username and the IP address that you came from, and then a description of the change. So if you log in as a different user, then where it says admin right here, it'll actually show somebody else's name instead. So that way you'll know if a change broke something on the firewall, you can track it back to who made it and when. And if you look at firewall rules, the firewall rules are each tagged with a created date stamp, or date and time stamp, and then also again your username and IP address of where they were created from. So if you see a rule that was disabled or changed in some way and it's not quite right, you can see exactly who made that change and when. Makes it easier to track down problems. Also, for non-administrative access, you can use users for OpenVPN, IPsec, captive portal, SSH tunneling, a lot of other purposes outside of the GUI. We'll talk about some of those here shortly. You can also do personalization. Individual users can have different themes, personalized dashboard, other behavior settings. Somebody may like the dark theme, somebody may like the light theme, and you don't have to set it for the entire firewall. Everybody can have their own behavior settings. And another reason would be for integration with an existing authentication structure. So rather than everybody having to know the admin password for every firewall, you could tie them all back to like a FreeRadius or OpenLDAP or Active Directory or something like that. And everybody would have their individual users that way rather than a generic account. All right, so the pfSense privilege system, how that works is the privileges are set on a per user basis, or those privileges can be inherited from a group. So there are privilege settings for almost every page on the firewall, including some like backend pages and service pages and things like that. But there are special privileges that are either composed of multiple pages, like the dashboard, because it has permissions not only for the dashboard but also for the support files that are called from the dashboard for things like widgets and fetching interface status data, and so on and so forth. Also special privileges for managing notices, for hitting help pages, and for looking at the crash reports, things like that. There's a special privilege for captive portal access, which is optional. Special privileges for VPN dial-in access for IPsec or LTTP or PPPoE. There's a new privilege in 2.4 for XML RPC synchronization, which I'll talk about toward the end. Several different types of SSH access privileges, which I'll go into detail on in a bit. There's a special privilege that will deny configuration right privileges, which means if a person has that privilege, they can't save any changes. They could actually edit, they can get to an edit screen, but they hit save, nothing is stored. So it will deny them write access like that. And it logs an error when they try. Now, most packages that we have, they don't hook into the privilege system, but there are some out there that do. There's a growing number of them. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many do, but I know some of the major ones are hooking into the privilege system now where they didn't before. It's getting better over time as we expand into that. So working with privileges, the best thing to do is use groups to speed up and simplify the process, sort of like using aliases with firewall rules. You add a permission to you create a group, you add the users to the group, and then everybody that has that access in that group, instead of adding the same privilege to 5 different users, you just add the permission to the group instead, and it's a lot easier to manage that way. They work out a lot better if you have a larger number of users, or if you have permissions that might change frequently. When you're working with a user or a group, you do have to, when you create it, the first time you create it, you have to make your initial set of settings and then save it and then open it back up, because you can't edit or add privileges to a user or a group when you're creating it at that time, because it has to already exist. If a user doesn't have dashboard access, like if in their privilege list, if the dashboard isn't one of those things they have, then they will just be redirected to the first page in their privilege list when they try to log in. Because the first thing it tries to load for everybody is the dashboard. If it can't load the dashboard, it'll look in their privileges, find the first page, and boom, it'll take them over there instead. So one thing you want to make sure of is you do not add the deny config right privilege to like the all or the admins group, because otherwise you're not going to be able to store any changes. I think we've added some safety belts around that lately, so it might not be as huge concern as it was before, but once upon a time we had some people add that deny config right to the all or admins group, and it was not a pleasant thing. We had to go into the shell and fix it, or to get that back. Another thing to look out for is you just do not select all on the privilege list. You want to be specific. If you select everything in the privilege list, you're going to give people maybe even some conflicting permissions. They're going to have that deny config right selected. It's not a good thing to go in and just select everything. If you want to grant everybody GUI privileges, you just have to pick one thing, the web config all pages, and then maybe give them shell access, and bam, that's it. They've got everything they need. There's no need to select everything in the list. And as a user logs in with these privileges, the menus will change, and I'll demonstrate that here shortly, so that the menus only show the options that the user has access to get to. So if a user doesn't have access to, say, firewall rules, then the firewall entry won't even show in the menu, or firewall rules, rather. There are some other things to look out for, though, to be aware of when you're editing with or working with these privileges. There is a privilege system here, but it's not perfect, especially, it does a good job of controlling access to the GUI, but pfSense still is not intended to be used as a general purpose Unix shell server. So don't just give out access to the shell like candy. You only want to make sure that your trusted administrators have access to that and not general users. There are some privileges you need to look out for. We have a list of them in the user manager, but just to reiterate, any of these things in one way or another can either be used to disrupt or gain additional privileges above what they've got. So any of these pages that I'm about to list, if a user has permissions to these, then they essentially have full administrator access to the entire firewall. The first one of those is like if you give them the user system copy files, which is SCP access, they could, maybe poke around the file system and find a file that may have sensitive data in it. The way pfSense is designed, some of the daemons and things, the file permissions may not be quite isolated as well as they should be ideally, but because it's an appliance and it works like an appliance, it's not intended to have untrusted access to those things. Another one is just giving somebody just full shell account access. In addition to what the concerns for copying files with SCP, they could upload and run their own executables. So for things like Meltdown or Spectre, you might have an issue there. So you don't want to allow that from anybody you don't trust. We have our standard all pages for the web configurator, and that is just full access to the GUI. So of course they'll have full access to the GUI if you give them that. If you give them the diagnostics backup and restore, obviously they can make a config backup, which could contain sensitive information from a section they don't have access to. If they can restore that configuration, they could download a backup, alter whatever they want, including giving themselves more access, and then upload that. So again, may not be what you want. Diagnostics command, somebody could do anything they want to the system, just like from the shell. They could upload files, they could run things, they could run other programs, they could make changes, they could alter the configuration, they could get anything sensitive on the box. So if somebody has access to that, they've got full access to the entire firewall. Similar with the edit file, somebody could read anything they want, they could write any file they want, including the configuration or source code. So that's another one you got to be on the lookout for. Giving somebody access to the factory defaults page, probably not a good idea. They could either disrupt things by factory defaulting your firewall, or they could factory default the firewall and then get full permission to access out through the internet. Maybe you've got really strict rules and they're trying to bypass that. So yeah, that would be a pretty nefarious thing to do, but it's not something most people need access to anyhow. So just be aware of that. Authentication servers, somebody could change the parameters on like an LDAP connection to change a filter and end up hopping to a different group type of thing. Similar with the user manager settings, somebody could point the GUI at a different authentication server, or change it away from LDAP to local authentication and use a different account than they're supposed to use as well. And if you give somebody access to the group manager or user manager, they can just add privileges to their groups or users until they can have full access. Or if they have access to the user manager, they can just make a brand new administrator level account from there. So those, it may seem obvious, but it's worth reiterating that if you give somebody these privileges, they have full access. So if you're trying to limit somebody to a certain subset of pages, avoid any of these. In a general rule that's comprised of all those entries back there. Just be careful of any pages or privileges that can execute commands or apply changes. You can deny config right, but that doesn't stop somebody from applying changes. If somebody else made a change and it's sitting there waiting to apply and you don't want to apply it yet, somebody who has deny config right could still apply that change because it's not writing a configuration, it's actually doing the apply action. And by default, when you log into SSH, if you're not the admin user or the root user, you will not get the menu that shows up because unprivileged users don't have access to all those commands that are run from the menu. You can use the sudo package to help with that. You can delegate somebody access to those commands, or you could give somebody full access with sudo, and then they could use sudo to run the slash etc slash rc.initial thing to pull up the menu if they want. And again, shell users, even if they're unprivileged, they still have access to files in other parts of the system that are sensitive. So I may sound like I'm repeating myself, but it's only because it's dangerous to ignore these things. So we got to make sure you realize what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about groups. Groups are the easiest way to manage privileges, like I was talking about earlier. Use them kind of like aliases. So we're just going to go under System, User Manager, and hop over here to the Groups tab. You can see I've got a few existing groups here, and they've got some of my users, but we're going to make a new group and a new user, and we'll try this out. So first things first, let's add a new group. Let's call it New Group. The scope, it can be local or remote. For a group on the firewall itself, like we're dealing with today, it would always be local. A remote group would be something for Radius or LDAP, a group that gets passed back from there. And those group names that are remote, they can be longer and they can have spaces in the names. They're not quite as restricted because a local group has to abide by the POSIX standards that are enforced by the operating system. It has to be under a certain name and it can't have any special characters. So there's a lot stricter requirements for a local group. You can pop in a description here. This is my new group. And we don't want to put anybody in this yet, but you could pick a person and click Move to Members. It'll add them as a member to the group. Similar, if you're editing an existing group and they're on this side, you hit Move to Not Members and you just took them out of the group. Whether you edit the group membership on the group or on the user, it's effectively the same. It's just depending on the kind of changes you're making, it may be more convenient to use one or the other. So right now we'll just save this. And we'll come back and edit our new group, which you can use the pencil or double click on the line. And now you can see we have this new section for assigned privileges. And we'll click the plus, and that gets us to the Add Privileges screen. So whether you're editing a group or a user, this Add Privileges screen works identically. First at the top of the page, you've got your user or the group that's being edited. You have your assigned privileges box here, and that's got all of the possible privileges for the entire firewall. Privileges, if you're editing an existing user that has privileges, anything they already have is omitted from this list because you don't have to worry about maintaining a certain amount of selections here. It's a lot easier this way, where the existing ones they've already got are hidden. That way you don't have to worry about deleting permissions here. You can only add permissions. So there's also this filter box down here if you don't know the name of a permission, but you kind of know what it is, or if you want to find everything in a certain area, like say we want to put in logs, you can type in logs and press enter, or you can come down here and click the filter button, and it will just filter it so it only shows you entries that have the word logs in them. You can clear that out and hit filter again or enter to get back to the full list. Now for this one, let's see, let's deny config right, and we'll do web config all pages. So they can get everywhere, but they can't save any changes. That'll be a good place to start. Then when you're done, hit save, and you'll see there's this little security notice that says, that they've got effectively have administrator level access. And one more little convenience thing here too. When we go back and edit this, you'll see again that web config all pages, it's gone from this list because they've already got that. But if you don't know what a privilege does, you can click on it like there, and then scroll down. There's a box down here that tells you with detail what it's doing. This page is, I'm on 243, and this page is in a little bit of flux right now because this privilege information here kind of pushed this down a little too far, and I think we're going to move this box right up under the other. So it should be a little bit easier, but for the moment, if you see it, you click on the permission, you can scroll down and see what's going on there. Okay, so that's really it for that group. And we hit all that. Now for user management, we'll go over here to the users tab, which is what's under system and user manager on the users tab. Let's add a new user. Call him somebody. And really the only fields you need are the username and password and confirm password. You don't have to fill in anything else. You can disable the account by checking that box at the top. You could set an expiration date. When you click on there, it'll give you a calendar, and you can pick, you can pick a month and a day to expire them if you want, or you can just enter it as, month, day, year there. You can have customized settings for the GUI. Let's go ahead and add some on here. You can change the theme. Let's say, oh, this guy wants the dark theme. He wants the fixed top navigation. We'll put the host name, the fully qualified domain name in the menu. Let's sort the interfaces alphabetically, and we'll just have some of these panels showing, and we'll put the browser to the display page name first in the browser tab. There we go. And now down here is a group membership, and I'm going to make him a member of our new group. If you have an SSH key already made for the user, you can add it in here. It's just a key that's made with SSH keygen, just the public key from that. You would paste that in here for the user. Some people get confused and try to add these keys in at the shell and get confused when they get overwritten or they're removed. It's because these authorized SSH keys must be put in the GUI and then they're synchronized from the config XML on the firewall onto the file system from there. IPsec pre-shared key, it's for an older mode of IPsec. We don't really encourage using that a lot anymore. It's not even XAuth or IKv2 or anything like that. It's a very, very old pre-shared key mobile style that I don't think a lot of people haven't used that in a long time, but we've got the setting hangout here because there's still a few people who need that. All right, so let's save this, and we've got our user here. And he's a member of our new group. And he's there. Oh, one thing I didn't show you here, you can create a certificate. If you have a certificate authority locally already, you can click create a certificate and just type in a certificate name. I usually give it the same name as the person or whatever. Pick the VPN or pick the CA that you want to make it with, key length and a lifetime. Then when you save, it'll go back and do that. Now, alternately, if you've already created a user, that control has changed. If you've already created a user, you get a little bit more control over what you can do. So if you click add, it actually takes you to a certificate manager style page where you can import an existing certificate, you can create a brand new internal one, or you can make a signing request, or you can choose an existing certificate that's already in the manager. So you could just collect that if you wanted to. But what I'm going to do, let's just make an internal certificate and we'll call it to somebody. It's a user certificate, so that's fine. We'll just hit save. And now you'll see here it's got that certificate listed. And if we go over here to the certificate manager, you'll see it in the list. So it's okay there. So let's have a look at this. So we've already gone through and edited groups and users. Let me log out here as me. I'm going to log in as that new user we made. And the first thing you'll see is that obviously the theme changed. and our menu is scrolling with us, and the firewall host name is over there. Everything is looking good. So it's got all our custom stuff. Let's go to a firewall rule. Now I have the deny config right, so this won't save here. See, it didn't save that change. It just looks like it did nothing. So if we go to the system logs, it'll show you here, save config permission denied by the permission. So if you suspect something, like if you've got a user that says they can't make changes, check the log. It'll tell you why. Let me log out of this one. And I've got a few other users I just want to show you. Now see, I just wanted to show you that because the user we made had all privileges to all pages. So this user can only see the dashboard and nothing else. And I also have access to the change your password page, so they can change their own password. And let's see, this one, they have access to some diagnostic pages, and they can change their own password. But again, it's a user with a custom theme. And this person only has access to some logs. But you'll see down here too in the logs, because these people don't have dashboard privileges, it logs that they tried to access the index page, and then it forwarded them onto something else, whatever the first thing was in the list they had. So again, it will show you this stuff, and you can have some assurance that if this, if you see a log like this, somebody might have just tried to hit the dashboard, or they might have tried to access something they shouldn't have. So it's things you could, if you're monitoring your logs centrally, you might have some sort of alerting set up on that. One thing I don't think let me get back in here under admin. I don't remember mentioning, but the privilege for a user being able to change their own password, and I've just got a group set up here for it. It's this web config system user password manager privilege. If that user has that, they can't access the user manager itself for other people, but they can get to a special page where they can change their own password. So that's handy for giving people so that they can log in and change their own password. So you don't have to know what everybody's passwords are. Okay, so on to SSH. So that's pretty much, that's it for the GUI. We'll go on to SSH. Under System Advanced on the Admin Access tab here, there's just a checkbox to enable SSH and a checkbox to pick whether you want passwords to be enabled or not, and then the port. The default port's 22, and the authentication method defaults to allowing passwords or keys. If you check this box here to disable passwords, then it will only allow public key authentication. So that's a lot stronger, but we'll get into that here shortly. So when you're looking in your permissions, you have several levels of access that you can grant a person for SSH. You could give them access for SSH tunneling, so that in their SSH client they could map a port locally on their computer that tunnels through to either something on the firewall or something behind the firewall. It works sort of like a proxy, and in some cases I think some clients can actually act as a SOX proxy as well. So you can point your browser or something at the SSH client port that you've got set up, and then proxy through that and have your traffic exit the firewall. So that can be useful as sort of a light VPN, but it's not something we recommend you allow just random people to do through the firewall anyway. If you want to do something like that, go ahead and set up a full-blown VPN like OpenVPN or IPsec, IPv2, something like that. If you give somebody the user system copy files permission, they can connect with SCP, like FileZilla, WinSCP, things like that. They can transfer files to and from the firewall. Or if you give them shell account access, they can do tunneling, they can copy files, or they can actually log into the shell and run commands. One thing to look out for, I mean, if somebody logs into SSH and uses the password command to reset their password, that's not going to stick. The next time that the users are synchronized on pfSense, it'll be set back to whatever their password is in config XML, because that's where pfSense stores the passwords, and that's where it wants them to come from. The admin and root accounts share credentials, so they're essentially the two sides of the same account. The admin account is locked into the menu, so you can't SCP using the admin account. You can only do SSH. The root user will work for SCP or SSH. You could even, do SSH remote commands with it. You just need to obviously have the right key or password to get through that. Other users, you can get into the shell or SCP depending on their privileges. Again, just to reiterate the security aspect here, if somebody has SCP privileges, they can read a lot of things off anywhere on the file system, and just to make sure, you might have some sensitive data they could get to. You may not want them to. And also other users, they don't get that menu at login because they don't have privileges, but you can delegate those, and we'll talk about that shortly here. So if you need to have a regular user run something that's a little bit higher access than they need, you can set up the sudo package to do that, which we'll demonstrate here in a little bit. And just because a user can't run a command, doesn't mean they can't see sensitive files. So again, it's a firewall, not a multi-user Unix shell server. So only trusted administrators should have SSH access. All right, so for SSH, there are several different authentication modes. I mentioned password. It's the least secure because it could be brute force, just weak passwords. Somebody could fight their way in. We do have a lockout daemon. I think you get 15 wrong password attempts in a minute or so. If you exceed that, whoever tried to log in like that gets locked out for an hour. So I think at least an hour. So it's not ideal to leave that open to the world of passwords, but it's, we do have some brute force protection there. Keyboard interactive is sort of like password, but it's a little bit more secure, but it's still password based, so you could still brute force it. Key-based authentication is the best, but it's more complicated to set up. Somebody has to run like SSH keygen. You run that. You make sure your public and private key pair. You take that public key and then hand it to the firewall administrator, who will put it on the user account and save it there. So yeah, a lot more setup there, but it's more secure because you can't brute force the key-based authentication. So and the client needs to protect that private key as well. So when you make the SSH key, the client they'll get asked if they want a passphrase. Obviously, you really do want a fairly good, a good strength passphrase on your key. There are, you can make a key without a passphrase. We don't recommend it, but people have done that for like service and backup accounts and things like that. It's not a good idea. There's also SSH agent and forwarding, which makes using keys more convenient. Some even like Linux distributions, when you try to connect to something that needs a key, it'll prompt you for the passphrase, and it kind of keeps that key cached in memory in the agent when you log into that. And agent forwarding is kind of neat. If you have your key on 3 different servers, if you log in from one that you've already decrypted your key to, and it does agent forwarding, you can then hop to another one, and as long as each one trusts the other one, because each one trusts the other one because you've already authenticated your key. Okay, let's see here. All right, sudo package here, and I may have slipped and called it sudo. In my brain, I keep reading it as sudo. I know, for years, ever since I started using it decades ago, I've called it sudo when I know it's voodoo, and mentally I know it's voodoo, or sudo rhymes with voodoo, blah. Tongue-tied there trying to explain it. But my brain still wants to read it as sudo. But it's su as in super user, do as in run, so sudo. You install the package from System Packages on the Available Packages tab, and you can find it in the list, and then click the usual or add and then confirm buttons and stuff there. And the default, or once you've got it on there, it shows up under System and sudo. And this is the default set of things here. So you've got your user permissions, you got root. The user group is the user that you're granting the permission to. And so, root can run commands as root. And the run as is going to be who they can run the command as. And most often this is going to be root. No password, so if you have that checked, then the user won't have to enter their password. If you do check that, or if you don't check that, the user will have to enter their password. I think it's like a 5-minute timeout. So if they're actively using it, they can continue to they get prompted for the password once, and then it will let them continue to run sudo commands until they're idle for about 5 minutes or so, and then it runs out. They'll have to enter their password again. The command list has that special keyword all there, and that all keyword means they can run any commands. Now, as you can see here in this command list layout I've got, you have several options here. You can run, if you specify the full path to a command without any parameters after it, then the user can pass whatever parameters they want. If you specify a command with a specific parameter after it, like this pfCTL-SS, then that is the only parameter they can ever use for that. They can't run it without parameters, and they can't run it with additional parameters. They have to run it exactly as it's shown. So if you want to restrict a user to run just the command with no parameters whatsoever, you have to use a pair of double quotes after it. So this like /bin/ifconfig with double quotes. Then they could see settings, but they couldn't alter them, for example. And if you have multiple commands, you just separate them with a comma. So like /sbin ifconfig, comma, /sbin pfCTL, comma, sbin ping, comma, ping6, so on and so forth. And if somebody runs a sudo command, it's logged to the main system log. There's advanced settings here. I'm not going to talk about those, but if you're familiar with sudo and how it works, you could add in your own files for sudoers or sudoers. I keep getting tongue-tied again. So just to kind of show you how this works, let's launch PuTTY here. I did not give our new user access to this. Let's log in as me. You can see I didn't get the menu. So if I try to run pfcontrol-ss just to show the states, permission denied. But if I do sudo, then I can see the states. So we're good. So I can do that. And if we go to the system log, we can see that it logged what I did with sudo. There's the sudo service, and then it shows the user, where they were, what directory they were in, the user they ran the command at, and the exact command they ran. So that is a nice accountability reference as well. And if we want to do SCP, let's try WinSCP here. I'm just going to log in as root here. Password is that. And you can see I'm in var log, and I can see log files. I could copy those back and forth if I wanted, and so on and so forth. So you can copy files back and forth, or I think you can even double click and open one. Now these log files are not in plain text, so that wouldn't be very meaningful. So I don't think there's anything else really worth messing with there at the moment. But you can browse through it like that. You can use WinSCP or FileZilla, or even a command line SCP client, whatever you need to do. Pretty straightforward. All right, so we've gone over this sort of thing before in several other Hangouts, including Hangouts on firewall rules and other ones that we've done on security and talking about the GUI and things like that. But you've really never in a million years put HTTP on the WAN for your GUI, open to the world. That's just a nightmare. You don't want to send your administrator passwords for the firewall out over the internet unencrypted, and you don't want to allow anybody anywhere in the world to hit that port. There is brute force protection, but it's just a risk you don't need. So don't allow that. So if you use HTTPS, which is better because it's encrypted, but you still have the port open to the world, that's still a pretty bad thing to do. Even on any port, because port scanners will find it. So really, it's just awful. Don't do that either. Now you get a little bit better. It's good if you have the HTTPS GUI and you have a restricted to a certain alias of selected hosts. You could even use dynamic DNS entries in your alias, so you have fully qualified domain names in there. Could be like a dynamic DNS entry, or who knows what, just a static host name, or it could be a network. So just be on the lookout for that. You want to make an alias and do that. That's one of the better, more common things we see people do. A little bit better if you move it to a non-standard port, but it's not required. Again, security by obscurity isn't really going to benefit you a whole lot, because port scanners, if it's still open, could still find it, but you're filtering it to only selected hosts, so it's really a little bit less convenient for you because the world can't get to it anyway. So that's not really great, but it is technically a little better than not doing it. But by far the best thing to do is just close the GUI port to the world. Don't ever open it. Really, just make it so you can get to it by VPN. Connect with OpenVPN, IPv2, whatever. Hit the GUI that way. Never open it to the world, and you're better off. Similar with SSH, similar tactics. If you leave your SSH port open to the world, you're going to have constant brute force attacks. There's scanners out there everywhere all the time, constantly hitting port 22 looking for servers, and then when they find a server, they just spam it to heck trying to figure out usernames and passwords for it. If you move SSH to an alternate port, it might benefit you very, very slightly, but only from casual scanners. I mean, if somebody could hit that port, could hit your entire IP address with the port scanner, find it, and still brute force you. Again, we do have brute force protection, but nothing is perfect. So I would not rely on that just because it's just a bad practice to leave it open to the world. Now, if you filter that by host, that's a little bit better. But obviously the best is key-based authentication. If you have key-based authentication, it can't be brute forced, then it's almost okay to leave it open to the world. I still don't really like doing it. I prefer to have VPN access, but key-based authentication, whether it's open to the world or select hosts, it's better than password authentication because you just don't have the risks associated with the brute forcing. All right, some more general security best practices. Again, only use encrypted protocols to access the firewall, whether it's HTTPS or SSH. If you're worried about errors in your browser, about the HTTPS certificate, you can go back a couple of months in the Hangout archive. We did a Hangout on using Let's Encrypt or the Acme package to get a trusted HTTPS GUI certificate for free. So that's an easy way around that. Again, reduce or eliminate use of the admin account. So everybody has their own accounts. Never leave any system password at the default value. So even if you don't intend to use the admin account, set it to something long and random and then disable it. Don't leave it at the default. Because if somebody comes along and enables the admin account and it's on a standard password, then somebody else could hop in there. Everybody has their own account, no sharing and no role-based accounts. So don't have an account based on somebody's position, actually have an account or a group or a department. Just give everybody their own account based on their name. There's a lot better accountability that way, and you don't have to worry about sharing credentials back to a group if somebody leaves or if there's any other changes like that. You should always use longer passwords. I think you can have bcrypt, I think it was 72 character limit. I think it was 72, I think is right. It says 72 or 71, but I'm pretty sure it's 72. So you want to have a longer password. Now, complexity requirements, I think that we don't enforce anything like that, or regular password changes. Those are really up to you. If you want to enforce those, you can. NIST is backed off of recommending complicated passwords or regular password changes in favor of longer passwords. So, put a sentence in there or a phrase, whatever. and you can work it that way. You can set an expiration date or disable accounts that only need temporary access. Like if you're working with us for support, make an account for us, and then set an expiration date on it, or disable it when it's not being used, that kind of thing. If you have multiple accounts for everybody, if a user leaves, say somebody quits, they I'm sorry, they part ways, get fired, whatever, you want to remove their account as soon as possible when they leave, so that somebody who no longer is associated with your company can't get into your firewalls. Don't expose your management services to the world. Use key-based authentication, VPNs where possible, and don't ignore physical security. I mean, we've talked a lot here about user access and everything for the firewall itself. You can set the password to be the console to be password protected, but it's not perfect. Somebody who really knows what they're doing could still bypass the protection on that, boot it into single user mode and mess with the password database. So you need to protect it physically as well. So if you are concerned about something like that, you would want to, make sure it gets locked in a cage or has some sort of physical security around it as well. Password protecting the console will protect you against casual users trying to change things, or cat hits your keyboard, that kind of stuff. But for real security, you have to actually get into, locking in a cabinet of some sort. Briefly about external authentication servers, you can use LDAP and Radius for the GUI access. You have to have local groups defined that match the user or group in LDAP or Radius, and they get passed back a special way. If a group has a space in it or a long name, you have to use that remote scope. If the authentication server is down, it will fall back to local authentication, but it will be kind of slow because it has to wait for a timeout. Radius and LDAP can be used for OpenVPN as well, or IPv2 IPsec. Captive Portal and L2TP do not hook back into the user manager at the moment. There are some patches out there for Captive Portal to patch it into the user manager. I think we're still testing those out. I don't think they've been merged yet. I'm not sure if they'll make 2.4.3 or just after that. But all of that's just a little bit of a taste, because next month we'll be talking about LDAP and Radius and how to hook that into the user manager and a couple of other places in the firewall. So that's all I had intended here. One more thing. The XML RPC sync on 2.4 used to be, it was always locked into the admin account, but now you can set it up with a privilege, the system HA node sync privilege. So what you would do for that is on both your primary and secondary, you make your user and call it sync or syncer, whatever, give it the same password, but you have to create this account on both systems initially. Then after the first time it synchronizes, you'll have that, it'll be automatically synchronized from there on out. But then, in your XML RPC settings, you can just put in the new username and password and use that. You don't have to use your admin password anymore. If you get locked out, you can reset the LAN IP address on the console, then it'll set your authentication back to local. Or if you do the password reset on the console menu for admin, it will re-enable the account and disable any expiration, that kind of stuff. And then you can use the script that's mentioned there on the screen to reset a password or change a password for a user. You just run that command, pfSSH.php space playback space change password space and then the username, and it'll prompt you for password to confirm. And it will also, if an account is disabled or expired, it'll reset that as well. Let's see. Oh, we already had some question here. Let's see. Somebody's asking about HTTPS open source. Staff can log in and download an OpenVPN client, deny admin users from logging in outside. Yeah, we don't have any kind of fine-grained stuff like that where you have both a location and everything else. So yeah, I'm not sure quite how that would work, but the existing privilege system doesn't have anything like that. And we get asked a lot about being able to download an OpenVPN client, and it's not something we're ever going to do, to my knowledge, because it's not secure. You have your VPN that's got a username and password, maybe a TLS key and certificates, and if you allow somebody to log in and download that themselves, you're reducing all those factors of security down to their username and password. So if we could figure out some way to do that securely, like maybe with a one-time password or a download token of some sort, We might be able to work something out like that, but it's not quite as easy as people want it to be. Just because, anytime you do that, it's drastically reducing the security of your VPN. If somebody gets your credentials, they could get your certificates and everything else, and then from there they can hop into the network and do whatever, all because they just had the username and password. So it's really throwing away a lot of your effort to keep things secure by reducing it down to that. So. Uh, Let's see. I don't know. So anything else? Any other questions or? All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and call it for today. If you have any additional questions, you can post on the forum or Reddit, comment on the blog, post anywhere, or just find us one way or another. And we will be back next month. And next month we'll be talking about Radius and LDAP. So just sort of a continuation of this with other authentication servers. We'll see you then.